So, the official chapter is out for My Hero Academia, Chapter 308, and there was a very interesting part about this chapter that I really want to talk about, particularly involving Deku and the 6th user in. And when it comes to their conversation, I think we may have been accidentally or unpurposely hinted at potentially what Deku's other new quirks are going to be from the 2nd and 3rd user. And that is what we're going to be talking about in this video. So before we can even get into that, let's hit the intro. Hit it! Hey guys, how's it going? It is your boy, Big Blue Drew 97 here, coming at you with another My Hero Academia discussion video. This time discussing what went down in Chapter 308, particularly when it comes to Deku and his conversation with the previous user of the smokescreen quirk. Because when it comes to this chapter, we got to see that Deku was able to fight Muscular and was able to basically give him that one punch, man. But what is even more interesting and what I found more fascinating about this chapter is the conversation that Deku had with this previous One For All user, and how through their conversation talking about the quirks that Deku was able to use, it could have hinted at potentially what the other two quirks are going to be, and we're going to go more into detail on what they could possibly be in the future. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you, if you haven't done so, to subscribe to my YouTube channel at Big Blue Drew 97 if you like this type of content, discussions about My Hero Academia, as well as manga chapter reactions, reviews, all that cool stuff. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, and without delay, let's get started. So for starters, let's go over exactly what was said between Deku and In about the 6th user of One For All, because for the most part, what is very interesting about the conversation, and for me personally, is how it's very reminiscent of a show that you may or may not have watched as a child called Avatar: The Last Airbender. Now, I'm not saying that Hirokoshi got context or was inspired by Avatar, because Avatar is a animated show made for Americans and Hirokoshi is Japanese, and he does take inspiration from American culture, particularly superheroes. But just because like a show like Avatar exists doesn't mean necessarily that Hirokoshi took inspiration from it, because when it comes to Deku, there is a lot of parallels between Avatar: The Last Airbender, specifically Aang as the Avatar, and Deku. First, Deku is a particular individual that is able to communicate basically with the dead predecessors of the previous quirk. In the same vein as in Avatar: The Last Airbender, Aang is able to communicate with his previous lives that are no longer alive, how they come from like different backgrounds, and how he can directly communicate with them and gain information about his past, in the same vein as how Deku can communicate with the previous users to gain a better understanding of his quirk. That in itself is very interesting, but also the fact that like he's able to commune with them past like a certain point, in which is not one individual, it's multiple individuals, in the same vein as also Avatar: The Last Airbender. Also, something else is that when it comes to their personalities, like, yeah, they are very similar, where they're somewhat like cowardly, or they express their emotions and not afraid to get sad, they're not afraid to get angry, they're relatively like emotional, and how they have this type of like complex with them to want to like save the world, but they have to do it in different ways, and how they have to deal with the burdens placed upon them by the world, with Deku being a quirkless individual and then gaining this amazing quirk, and with Aang being the last living vestige of the Airbenders. So there's a lot of parallels to be made with this, but what I really want to tackle is the conversation between Deku and In when it comes to the predecessor, because this is something very interesting. It was set up a few chapters ago about how when it comes to how the communications and how Deku is going to be communicating and talking with the previous users of One For All, they said that they wouldn't like pry into Deku's like private life and how they wouldn't intervene, but they never specifically said that they would never like talk to him unless that he's unconscious. And this just shows like how much One For All has grown to the point where now Deku is able to communicate with the previous users without having to be unconscious. Now we're only seeing that he's talking to one particular individual, specifically In, so this means that he may not be able to talk to like 2 or 3 at a time, but because he's able to talk to one, he's able to get like specific information, specific help from one person at a time. That's still interesting because that means that you have 2 people coming with plans and strategies instead of just Deku doing it. So that's very interesting, as well as because we get to see In communicating with Deku, we get the reveal of what the Deku's 4th quirk is, the quirk of the 6th user, In, which is smokescreen, which is something that was very obviously televised by his name with the kanji or katakana, meaning smoke. I think it's kanji, which means smoke, so it was very obvious that he would have a smokescreen quirk. And something interesting that was brought up between In and Deku is how Deku is not able to use smokescreen as effectively, which is why he's talking with In to try and gain that better understanding, because in his fight with Muscular, he was unable to like control the output of smokescreen. And basically what In was saying is that because One For All made his smokescreen quirk more powerful, it most likely what that would entail is that it becomes like more powerful in a way of it's able to spread over long distances. It could be most likely thicker, and that it can produce more smoke than it probably could have if In was using it. So that just shows that One For All boosts the quirks themselves to a degree that the previous quirk users would not have known. And In is trying to tell Deku's like, yeah, because of One For All, yeah, this is a whole lot of smoke. You probably should dial it back next time. And this ties more into what he talks about with Deku when it comes to how Deku is using the quirks. So we have Deku talking with In, and In brings up a point that Deku, for the most part, begins to take to heart, which is eventually going to tie into potentially what Deku's other 2 quirks from the 2nd and 3rd user are. But In basically tells Deku that when it comes to the quirks that are inside of him, when it comes to these quirks, that most of these quirks aren't like standalone abilities, and that they cannot be ultimate moves in themselves, which makes a whole lot of sense. Just looking at the moves that we have, a Black Whip, yeah, it can be very powerful, yeah, it can grab people, but it's not like it can do like a finishing like blow on someone. It can be able to restrain them, it can throw people around, but it doesn't have like the capability of like finishing someone off. And the same can be said about Smokescreen as a distraction. Float just amplifies Deku's ability to fly, and Danger Sense, which allows him to basically dodge incoming attacks or sense danger. And because he specifically states that our quirks, most likely referring to all of the previous users of One For All, are standalone abilities and may not be ultimate moves, this could imply that the 2nd and 3rd users' quirks aren't going to be like extremely battle focused or battle centered. And this is very important because later on In states that when it comes to Deku, that he has too much respect for quirks and how he should be viewing them as tools in his arsenal and using them in strategic ways, as we cut to an image of Deku and the 4 quirks that he's able to use with One For All are being represented by different tools, where Danger Sense is represented by a walkie-talkie, Black Whip is represented by a rope, Float is represented by a jetpack, and Smokescreen is represented by a flare. And this is something very interesting because this isn't the first time that someone has brought up the idea that Deku is over-reliant or has a greater like sense of putting quirks on a pedestal where it shouldn't be, because it ties into the idea that Deku values quirks too much. He puts them on a pedestal higher than they should be. And this is very important because this is something that isn't addressed primarily in this chapter, but was something that was brought up multiple times, especially in chapter 47 and 48 during the Stain arc, where Gran Torino basically talks to Deku about how he has too much respect for All Might and that their shackles holding him back. And how when he was trying to learn how to use full cowling, he viewed One For All, particularly when it comes to strength, as him using or not using the quirk and that if he's able to master his quirk in the same vein as like Aizawa Sensei and Kirishima, that his quirk could have potentially endless possibilities, and how many other individuals use their quirks in a way that is very natural as breathing. And this is all well and good, but the problem is that is specifically focusing on the idea of one for all being one quirk. Yes, Deku would have to be able to fully master these other quirks, but because he holds these quirks in too high of esteem and thinking like, oh yeah, they've been having these quirks their entire lives, they've been able to master it this entire time, what he may have failed to realize is that, yeah, they've been mastering it this entire time, but because they've had it this entire time, they don't have this sense of, oh yeah, this quirk is so amazing because I have a quirk. Yet they were born with a quirk, so they don't have this idea of like, oh yeah, just having a quirk is great because they were just already born with it. And that is something that Deku hasn't realized, and this isn't the only time that we see it, because if we cut back to when he, Bakugo, as well as All Might are talking about the potential quirks of One for All, as well as the previous users, in chapter 247, basically Bakugo calls out the fact that the quirks that are in One for All may not all be that great, and even Deku's like, no, that's not true, they have to be great. But All Might agrees with Bakugo to an extent that, yeah, the quirks themselves aren't great because One for All wasn't meant specifically for those people that had great quirks or had like the best quirks. They were just passed on so they could grow stronger and stronger, and that the people weren't chosen. It was just by chance that they were given the quirk. And this is very important because this highly implies that it's very likely that the first two users' quirks may not be combative, and that they're just going to be quirks that amplify or just work well with the other quirks, but cannot do like a whole lot of damage on their own. So this kind of ties into like the idea that all of these quirks are basically going to be tools that Deku are going to be using to improve his fighting style and give him advantages without them necessarily being crucial in themselves. And with this idea in mind, we can cut really into what I really want to talk about, and it's how, when it comes to that visualization of the quirks, how that could be potentially hinting at what Deku's other two quirks from the second and third user could possibly be, and I'm going to go over those possibilities right now. So, when it comes to this image, and when it comes to what these specific tools represent, it's very interesting that most of them are tools that you can potentially find or you would potentially use in a survival or slash rescue bag, or items that you would use when you're trying to survive by yourself or when you're trying to rescue someone. Mainly when it comes to the walkie-talkie, the rope, and the smoke flare, which could represent Danger Sense, Black Whip, as well as smokescreen quirk. Backpack slash jetpack represents float, but there is an equivalent of that in our real world that's more fictional, but you can equate that to just being a general backpack and all. So with that in mind, the other two quirks could be tools that you use in a survival kit or a survival bag when you're on your own, or even a rescue bag. And when it comes to that, I've done a little bit of research and I've come up with a list of potential like items that could be represented as quirks of the second and third user. So for starters, I want to go over like a little bit of like some interesting information about these items prior and the categories that they would fall in, because when it comes to survival guides, what I've learned that there are 10 like essential like steps that need to be taken to create a survival guide backpack thing before you go out and exploring in the wild, and that these 10 specific essential categories are navigation, illumination, first aid kit slash supplies, fire, repair kits, signal and communication, sun protection, insulation, nutrition, hydration, and an 11th one, you got emergency shelter. When it comes to the optional ones, mainly signaling and communication is optional, but when it comes to this idea, from the items that we see, they can pretty much fall into one of these 11 categories. Walkie-talkie slash danger sense falls under signaling and communication, as well as the smokescreen can fall under that category as well, and black rip can fall under the repair kit. So that's something that's interesting, that potentially these tools can fall into one of these 11 categories. But the ones that we really want to focus on are signaling and communication, repair kit, fire, first aid, illumination, and navigation. Because illumination, the smokescreen could also fall under illumination as well. And I have a list of potential items that can fall under potential quirks for the second and third user. So first up, we have a map / GPS, and for that, I think that's where danger sense can also fall into, because map help you like look through certain areas and find out where you are. With danger sense, can help you get out of like dangerous situations. So I think that danger sense could potentially be like a map / GPS as well as the walkie-talkie representation. But the second thing is a fire starter / match / lighter, and this ties into the idea of how this could potentially be one of the second and third users' quirks, but that falls under the idea that if it's like a small like fire or a small spark, if you add one for all to it, that could potentially be like an ultimate move in itself, because we've seen in the story that when you have a character like Dabi or even with Shoto, that a big old flame, even with Endeavor, that a big old flame can definitely be a finishing move. But because Ian specifically stated that the other quirks are more standalone abilities and that they cannot be ultimate moves, I do not think that we can have a fire-like quirk that was with the second or third user, because it would not fall under that idea of being, it would fall under the idea of being an ultimate move, where these quirks would not necessarily be that. So I'm going to have to rule out like a fire-based quirk. And that also rules out another quirk that he could potentially have that ties into a part of the survival kit, which is a knife / multi-tool. Because like I said, when it comes to a knife, if it's like a small little like razor blade that could come off the tip of his fingers, yeah, that wouldn't do anything. But if you amplify that with one for all, that could just be like a big F-off like sword, or just a long blade that could be equal to an ultimate move. So I do not think that it would be one of the second and third users, because these quirks have to be standalone abilities that can't act as ultimate move. Next up, we got like a flashlight / headlight, and when it comes to that, that can be in the category of illumination, but it can also be in a form of like communication, because something else that they have with flashlight and headlights is that they have a signaling mirror that you can use to signal for help. So that could all fall under illumination, but that could also fall under the preview of smokescreen, because it's like smokescreen like covers an area while like lights would be able to distract people. It would basically serve the same purpose as smokescreen, so I think that that's very unlikely as well, but it's still a possibility. Another tool that can be equated to a quirk is a compass. We've actually seen someone with a compass quirk in Vigilantes, so I do not think that that would be a quirk that's a part of One for All, so I'm ruling that out. Emergency whistles, that could be something that the previous user had, because that is something that can be very helpful for communicating, or when you're lost or you're stuck, an emergency whistle can help get someone to your location. And when it comes to like a whistle, that could be something that he has, like a sound-based quirk, which basically can like hinder a person's movement because it's so loud and like it stuns them. That can also be a possibility. We got rope, fishing lines / tape, that falls under potentially a repair kit, but that also serves the purpose of like black whip being a rope. But here's where I really want to get into first aid kit. Now, when it comes to Deku, he has a tendency of destroying his arms and legs, and from what we're seeing here in this chapter, he does have full use of his arms, so we don't really know the extent of the damage and how it's affected his body, but it seems as if it hasn't really affected him that much. But maybe that's because the second or third user's quirk is sort of like a first aid kit. It gave him like a general like healing buff, or it gave him a healing factor in a sense that allowed for his body to heal a little bit over time. He may not be in the same condition that he was at the beginning of the story, but maybe is able to heal him up to a point where like his arms are now being able to use, or that maybe it like healed him up or patched him up faster, so his natural healing allows him to heal faster, so he didn't take as much damage, or he would still be able to do the things that he's able to do, even though his body isn't fully up to snuff, but it's better than what it was when he was in the hospital. So potentially one of the quirks could be a first aid kit. Another thing that he could have is like sunglasses / sunscreen to help with trying to like get out like sun protection, be used as sun protection. I don't think that's actually going to be the case, mainly due to the fact that when it comes to his mask, he already has like sort of like built-in sun protection with his like eyes. They're blackened out, so he's able to see through the smoke, and that is something that's specific with his costume, so I do not think that's going to be a quirk. Like I said, walkie-talkie, water filter is something else when it comes to the category of hydration, but I don't think that's really going to be a quirk in itself. Like Deku's going to somehow be able to purify water or purify the environment, maybe, but I think that is very unlikely. And then a backpack is something that to hold all the tools in. That could be the jetpack, that could be the representation of float. So yeah, that's a general idea of like everything that you would have in like a survival kit / rescue kit, besides like more of like the industrial size like mechanisms. Like if you're trying to get someone out of a car, get like a boulder off of them, most likely that won't be something that is represented of Deku. But with all of these in mind, I think the most likely options for the second and third user's quirk is probably going to be, I would say, something like light related to like blind someone, like smokescreen to hinder their sight, light to blind them, so that's a possibility. First aid may be like the most like obvious and like specific one that I think is a very high possibility of Deku having. Just having his own medical kit on him at all times. When he destroys his body, maybe he can revert it back to a point before it's destroyed, in the similar vein as Ares, so that's another possibility. And the two less likely possibilities of what we've seen so far is like a fire starter, matches lighter, which could represent him having like a fire-based quirk, which I wouldn't think is going to be the case, because that also coincides with the smokescreen quirk, which, you know, if it's a flare, it started with fire, so I don't think that's going to be the case either. As well as a knife / some type of multi-tool object, I don't think that's going to be the case either, but most likely it's still a likely option. And the reason why I also want to bring up the idea like of like the knife as well as like the fire starter like potentially still being one of the quirks is because there's a theory that I don't agree with personally, that the second and third users are Bakugo and Kirishima respectively. They somehow have gone back in time, was able to get the quirk of One for All, pass it on to one another, and then pass it on to the fourth, fifth, sixth user, whoever they are. And I have a problem with that because that wouldn't make sense story-wise, because that means that if they go to the past, there wouldn't be a way for them to come to the future, because this would have happened like 100 or so years in the past. So it would mean that they would either be very old or they would die, and I think that would just be a waste of their characters in the show of My Hero Academia, Bakugo and Kirishima, where they could do something more in the present than doing in the past. But because that theory is out there, I cannot completely rule out the idea that the other two quirks could be like Knife, which would be like Kirishima's hardening, as well as the Fire Starter, which would be Bakugo's explosion. So yeah, I think with this representation of these survival tools on Deku, the smokescreen, the walkie-talkie, and the rope, that potentially having a med kit be a representation of a quirk, having a flashlight being another representation of a quirk, being a knife being another representation of a quirk, and being a fire starter, matches, and lighter being another representation of a quirk on his body, because they're all related to like survival tools in a survival backpack or something of that sort, that those could potentially, we could potentially theorize on what the second and third user's quirk could be based off the representation of the quirk in Deku's mind of Black Whip being a rope, Danger Sense being a walkie-talkie, Float being a jetpack, and Smokescreen being a signal flare. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to talk about when it comes to this chapter at this moment. Potentially, like what I just brought up in this video, I know it's still a little bit like wild, maybe you didn't really understand it, but I think that specifically seeing how Deku visualizes, as well as N tells Deku to visualize these quirks as tools, and that they're represented as like modern day tools that you could potentially use in a survival kit, except for, you know, the jetpack, that this could potentially have hinted at the fact that the other two users' quirks could be related in one way or another to survival/rescue items, such as the ones that I listed before. So potentially we could like theorize what these quirks are based off that idea, or it could very likely be that they could be completely different quirks altogether that could be like the jetpack and be a representation of tools found in the hero world, which from what we see, the walkie-talkie, the smokescreen, and the rope are three things that we can have in our own world, but potentially the other two quirks could be like the jetpack, things that don't exist in our world, but theoretically could in fiction, maybe. I don't know. These are just my thoughts. What do you think? Do you think that we could potentially already know what the quirks are? Do you think that it could be one of the things that I mentioned? Could it be one of the things that I haven't mentioned? What do you think that could represent the other two quirks? What tool do you think could represent the other two quirks? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Leave a like on this video if you liked it. Hit the notification bell for whenever I upload more My Hero Academia content. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Do all that cool jazz. And hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!